If you are a C.S. Lewis nerd, as many people are, you maybe know that his favorite author was George MacDonald. He credits fantasy author George MacDonald with baptizing his imagination, especially through the book Phantastes, which was one of Lewis's favorite. After reading MacDonald's descriptions of magical enchanted forests, he said, for example, and these descriptions were written in a way that Lewis found incredibly beautiful, he felt that this sense of enchantment forever spilled out onto Lewis's experiences of real forests. Now, in what way does something parallel happen with religious narratives? How does the story of Jesus, for example, able to change lives and the way we live and move in the world forever? Could it be through the human faculty of imagination? Justin Ariel Bailey approaches these themes in his book, Reimagining Apologetics, The Beauty of Faith in a Secular Age, which is a book that's only kind of about apologetics, at least in the traditional sense of the term. It's really about a kind of anthropology that takes the cognitive function of imagination to be central to our humanity. The imaginative and aesthetic dimensions of understanding then must take the lead in our talking about faith, rather than argumentation, which has been the traditional mode of apologetics. Justin A. Bailey is a theologian, author, and assistant professor of theology at Dordt University. You can learn more about him at pjustin.com. That's the letter P, justin.com. Justin was also part of Blueprint 1543's theopsych initiative. Resources on psychological science from that project are available for free on our website, blueprint1543.org, or at theopsych.com. I'm Sari Martin Concepcion, Director of Communication at Blueprint 1543. I really enjoyed my talk with Justin, and I hope you will too. Yeah, I mentioned this to you in an email that like one of my intensives I took at Fuller was the C.S. Lewis intensive.
Okay.
And I basically wrote one of my papers for that class on like the same thesis as your book, basically. But I just constructed it from C.S. Lewis because C.S. Lewis is kind of known as a kind of apologist, you know?
Right.
I sort of made it wove an argument based on like more implicitly, does Lewis value the role of imagination? Because, you know, he's living around that Enlightenment time where he's got all these people like, you know, throwing their arguments around, and he deals with the arguments a little bit. But I think that for him and his own conversion, especially having that imaginative encounter with Jesus was really what did it for him, you know, the myth that became true.
Yeah.
And I think you probably referenced this maybe in a chapter I didn't read, but the baptizing of the imagination is a phrase that Lewis uses in regards to George MacDonald.
Yeah.
And I actually just finished reading Phantastes, which a lot of people don't care for that much actually, but for Lewis, it was like life-changing. And
well, I'd love to hear what you thought of it because I mean, MacDonald is a hero of mine and I'm always interested to hear what people think of Phantastes.
Yeah, I really liked it. Did it
baptize your imagination as well? Or rebaptize?
I haven't actually, yeah. Well, so, I mean, I feel with my own spirituality, my own faith, that the origins of, you know, my lifelong faith, really the fantasy literature I read when I was a kid was really foundational and did have that effect that Lewis talks about MacDonald having on him of like, just the whole world becomes enchanted based on, you know, reading of the mythical enchanted forest sort of makes all real life forests a little more enchanted, you know. Madeleine L'Engle was another, like I read the whole Wrinkle in Time series when I was young and all the Narnia Chronicles and stuff. I'm not as read in Tolkien as a lot of people like me are. Just when I was younger, it didn't grab me as much. But yeah, those were huge for me and sort of laid the foundation for like a spiritual life, which has followed me forever. And, and even now, as I'm older and I'm engaging with science quite a bit, especially because my job and how science like dialogues with faith and thinking about those things, you know, some people might think that engagement in science has the ability to sort of de-enchant things for you because it gets in the mechanics. I sometimes get that, but it doesn't have to. If you talk to a lot of scientists who are just in awe of nature, a lot of them find that sense of enchantment about the world increases as they get into more detailed research. So it's interesting.
I could talk about George MacDonald for hours, but in some ways you mentioned Lewis, and people sometimes ask me, well, why didn't you write more about Lewis? And I sort of felt like that work has been done many times.
Yeah, like the world.
And if there was anything else I could do with Lewis, I don't know if there is anything left to do. And so I was sort of trying to get underneath him and see, well, how did he become how he became? And so that led me to MacDonald. And then now I've fallen in love with him. My love for MacDonald surpasses my love for Lewis now.
Yeah.
And so you should listen to the MacDonald chapter.
I for sure will.
In the book, which is my favorite chapter, is the one that I think I enjoyed writing the most. And it talks a lot about that. But, MacDonald has this really interesting conception of the relationship of reason and imagination. Lewis is famous for saying, the intellect sort of takes things apart, the imagination puts them back together. And I like that. But MacDonald's is even better because he says the intellect is sort of like the laborer and the imagination is the architect. Or the imagination is the visionary guide that sweeps across the borders in search of new space. And the intellect is sort of the plotter, like the person who carries the bags like behind. And I just love that because it really gives a space for both and shows how they need each other and how they work together. So MacDonald also is very interested in science, in chemistry, and in keeping the imagination connected to the empirical. So there's some interesting things with that. But I could talk about MacDonald's for a long time. But.
Yeah, and we'll go to that. But you do talk quite a bit about the imagination is always engaging with the real world, with the worlds that we actually exist in. So, there doesn't have to be a dichotomy there. But real quick, I wanted to say about Fantastes was I haven't read fiction for a long time. As I get older, I'm like, who has time for fiction? Like you have to read practical things that teach you things, So I've fallen into that trap a little bit. So it was so nice to kind of go back there, honestly, to go back into like just being sort of letting yourself exist in this imaginary world for a while. And it's so clear, like this character's spiritual journey, because it's just like, it's such a meandering thing. It's like this happens and then this happens and then this.
It's a fever dream. Yeah.
Yeah, totally. But if you just kind of have that to your expectation, you're just going to go on this journey with this person and weird stuff like definitely couldn't predict, weird stuff keeps happening and taking you by surprise. Yeah. My only critique is a little bit of a, slightly feminist one, but that's just of the time. It's just the role of like women of the enchanted forest are just like, either they're like, they fall in love immediately and they're like the most beautiful creature he's ever seen, or it's a witch,
Sure. Yeah. It's sort of that mythic archetype, right? That he's primarily working with.
Right. Yeah.
I mean, so his career is sort of bookended by Fantastes and Lilith.
I haven't read
Lilith is his kind of last one that I think is a just masterpiece. Because he's read the Divine Comedy, is trying to give you his own version of Dante, having, if you read it with like Lilith and the Divine Comedy in the backdrop, I'm not sure if he quite gets out of the trajectory of what you're saying from sort of the feminist critique, but there are some really interesting things that he does, with that main character of Lilith,
cool.
Who has a long lineage as well. But yeah, that would be the thing I don't always recommend it to everyone because it is sort of the capstone of a lot of his other work. And so he's doing things that are building on, but if you've read Fantastes, then I don't know. I'd love to know what you think about it.
Oh yeah. I'm definitely going to check that out. Very exciting. Well, let's get to your book. Do you think you could just kind of give a little summary or just a summary of your thesis, the thesis of the book?
Yeah. So the book is called Reimagining Apologetics, and it kind of puts together these two circles that don't often come together. So the one circle is the imagination, which is sort of this faculty of possibility and desire and exploration. And then the other thing is apologetics, which is the discipline that is oriented towards responding to objections to Christian faith. And I'm trying to put them together and say that, crises of faith and doubt, however we navigate them, whether we're moving from a more stable faith to in the direction of doubt, deconstruction, or whether have been deconstructing and you're moving towards reconstruction, that is experienced not primarily in the intellect, but in the imagination, or at least they're experienced simultaneously in both the intellect and the imagination. And so the way that people of faith have tended to do apologetics has tended to be very much sort of top-heavy, so to speak, which is oriented towards the intellect. And in fact, apologetics in the last couple hundred years has really become a kind of a shrunken version of what it has been throughout church history, along with sort of a shrunken anthropology that we have that tends to favor the intellect. It has tended to focus on defending the truth, right, of the Christian faith. And I'm fine with that. I think there's definitely a place for that. And where those objections are, we need to have good answers to those questions. But I just want to say that, a life of faith is about so much more than just believing truths. And so I wanted to ask, well, what would it look like to do apologetics or to bear witness to Christian faith if the imagination mattered? And so that's what I'm trying to do, is sketch a picture of what it could look like to think about apologetics or about bearing witness to Christian faith in a way that takes the imagination into account and doesn't just treat people as, sort of people who are in need of the right information, and that'll change everything.
Yeah, I think a lot of us have probably had the experience of, apologetics done badly or kind of cringy, or impolitely. So I think your book is a really good response to some of that. And then also this, the everyday Christians having sort of this anxiety about it. What if I'm called upon to answer a question about my faith that I can't answer? And maybe that even inhibits people from even talking about their faith at all. Yeah. Which I think that your paradigm sort of relieves some of that anxiety, because you learn to speak genuinely about your own faith and what it does for you, I honestly really debated whether to call it apologetics or not, because can that word be kind of won back from the kind of picture that we have of two gladiators kind of on stage fighting it out. Yeah. And I think that part of that apologetic picture tends to picture faith as this individual achievement, so, I've gotten to this place where I've triumphantly vanquished all of the objections and doubts that I have. And if we think about the imagination, then faith becomes a lot more about community project, a craft, right? Like faith is a craft that we're engaged in. It's receptive and it's responsive to something that's real, but that we can't control. The same way that people sort of, if you approach faith as more the way that people approach art, then you sort of know, I'm not really in control of this thing, and yet there are practices I can engage in that make me more open to. And that's really what I'm interested in studying. The imagination is the faculty that does that explores those possibilities and is able to even go beyond our normal, the things that we can kind of get at with our senses. And I think that most of our life is actually lived in that space. And then intellect sort of comes and justifies it, right? And gives us reason to support it. But we start with the more kind of intuitive, imaginative sense of rootedness in whatever place we are. And then we look for kind of the intellectual considerations to justify it. Yeah. So without getting too philosophical, because I won't be good at that, the fear some folks might have, and maybe you've encountered this in response to your book, is that truth just becoming relativized. Yeah. Because there's so much subjectivity to what you're saying. You're talking about responses to art or whatever. So how would you respond to that fear? Yeah. Like I said, I have these two circles, sort of the imagination and aesthetic circle, and then the apologetic circle. And the people in each circle are suspicious of the other side, right? So the apologetics people are like, oh, all those subjective stuff about the imagination. And the aesthetics people are like, wait, don't you dare take my art and instrumentalize it, in service of convincing somebody, about their faith. And so, I guess I'll just say that I'm sensitive to that, to both sides, right? To the desire to do justice to both. And part of it is the way that I define the imagination. The imagination is something that we use. It is a unique faculty because it is able to orient itself towards irrealities, towards what is not actually the case, but it does that for the sake of reality, right? We kind of explore possibility and detach from what is actual, because we believe that
ultimately doing this will enable us to grasp the world more securely. And so we are in search of reality. We are in search of rootedness in the real world and the ability to navigate it. And so we are responsive then to the givenness of the world, a world that we did not make, that we are not in control of, though we have agency and participation in that. And so that's where it's sort of that kind of empirical side of that I am always responding to something in my imaginative work. I'm not just sort of making things up. So the imagination is a strategic and intentional faculty. So it's strategic because we imagine to do something that we can't do with any other mode of perception. And then it's intentional, meaning it's always directed towards something. You can't just imagine, right? You have to imagine things. And so I think that that's the way that I'm trying to guard against the subjectivity, is that even if we take faith as testimony, I'm testifying, or as a community, we're testifying to something that is real, something that happened. The subjectivity of our starting point doesn't mean that our ground is subjective. And so right. there's a difference between where you start. So you might start with people's hopes and dreams and desires. That doesn't mean you have to end there. It doesn't mean that they get the final word, because there's also this other story of what God is doing. There's revelation, the idea of revelation, where God is an other who shows up to speak in Christ and the Spirit and in the scriptures and in the church, and other people, right? So there's these other people that I can't reduce to myself, and their experiences that I can't reduce to, my own imaginative projections. And so those are really the checks and balances for an imagination which is purely escapist, is that our grasping for rootedness in the world is always going to be dialogical in terms of our relationships with other people, with the community that we're in, and in the createdness of God's world in which we find ourselves.
That's so good. Let's talk about Jesus for a second, or just in the scriptural witness, you have the evidence of God's just like extreme variety and willingness to bend to what folks need, the way that Jesus kind of responds to each person so differently, responding to their individual desires and longings. And sometimes God needs to talk to someone through a donkey, and, and so, or the still small voice, or, there's just such a variety in the way that God or Jesus, God in Jesus, responds to individual people in their subjectivity without relativizing the truth of who God is or who he is. You use the word honoring in terms of like honoring other people's unique longings or something like that in the book. And I really liked that. I really thought that was a very neighborly way to do apologetics.
Yeah, it's a hospitality. It's sort of towards what's going on in people's lives. And that's really grounded on a conviction of just divine generosity, and that God has not abandoned his creation to corruption, but that God continues to engage people in all sorts of ways. And like you said, it's not just in Jesus' ministry, but also in the scriptures themselves. They are given to us not as bullet points. You don't have, hey, here's 501 things about God. You have poetry and parable and apocalyptic, all of which genres require imaginative dexterity. You have to actually learn to train your imagination to be able to get what they're trying to say, right? And if you just treat it as bullet points, or you try to turn it into another genre, then it's been a failure of your imagination. In your desire to get truth, you actually have missed this very significant layer of truth, which is the truth that's found in the way that it engages your imagination.
Yeah. You're talking about using the imagination to sort of lead you into the life of faith. But once you are a Christian or a follower of Jesus, or however you identify, what does that look like using your imagination as a Christian to explore possibilities, because I think we all kind of want to have arrived or have the certainty and stuff. And of course there's, whatever you hold on, you have your non-negotiables or whatever, but I'm very curious about what the role of imagination in the life of faith looks like as you grow in your spiritual journey.
Yeah. One of the things I always try to emphasize with my students, especially because I have some students who are a little bit suspicious of the language of imagination, maybe rightly so, but that you're already using your imagination all the time, And because we are these embodied desiring, imaginative creatures, our imaginations are always being shaped by all sorts of things, our practices, our ritual practices, going to church, not going to church, watching television, not watching television, all the media we consume,
right.
Just all sorts of things are always shaping it. And so your imagination is either going to be, so if I am always sort of dwelling on fear, this is the example I always use. I hear a noise in my house at night. And what happens in that moment? Well, my imagination supplies a possibility for me. Right. And sometimes it's amazing how fully formed the picture is, right?
Yeah.
You can imagine the person coming to hurt you and your family or whatever. And that's a normal function of the imagination in some sense, because it's always trying to kind of fill in the pictures, the blanks for you so that you can live more securely in the space that you're at. So in some sense, the imagination is inseparable from just coping with reality. But my imagination is either going to be formed by fear and by cynicism and by despair, or it's going to be formed by faith and love and hope. And really, you can't hope without imagination, because hope is oriented towards this future reality and the desire for something to be the case. And the idea, can tomorrow be better than today? And can I be better? Can I be changed or not? Can people change? Can this loved one that I have change? And how do I relate to them if I believe they can change, or versus if I don't, if I think things are always going to be this way. And so that's what I mean when I say it's just sort of the everyday use of your imagination, that sense that you have of your space in the world, how you're related to God, how you're related to the people around you. At a certain point, just in the last year, I sort of felt like everything that I was hearing and seeing was almost like conspiring to make me despise my neighbor. And I had to really think about, okay, what are the things? Why do I feel constantly like I'm being placed in this kind of shrinking space where I just am having these horrible thoughts about, the people who live around me. And that's a use of the imagination. And so for a Christian who wants to have their sense of what is possible to be rooted in reality, but not reduced to what we can see, right? Because God is able to do more than we ask or imagine. And engaging with always, because when God is in the picture, there is a level of hope and there is a level of possibility that would not have been open to us otherwise. And so that means that to hope Christianly, not just for the future that, God will make the world right somehow, but just in our everyday life and everyday situations, the imagination, training the imagination to hope, training the imagination to relate to my neighbor in love, and to not define them by their worst moments or by their worst characteristics, training my imagination to respond in faith, in trust towards God, and believing that underneath all of the brutality, that what's deeper than brutality is beauty, right? And so, you always have sort of this, you feel like there's this competition always. Which one is deeper? Is brutality really deeper, or is beauty really deeper? And Chesterton says, evil is so evil that we think all the good is an accident, and good is so good that we think evil can be explained. And so at the end of the day, which one do you, to live with faith in a very real way is to say, I'm going to intentionally orient my life in faith that beauty is deeper than brutality. And that the brutality is sort of spoiled goodness. It's evil that has sort of entered in and corrupted it. And we are participants in that.
Your next book is The Imagination and Christian Discipleship.
That one's in the pipeline. I'm working on a different one right now, but yeah, the next one that's sort of something I'm thinking is healing the diseased imagination. Because that's the thing about, this is Willie James Jennings, who wrote what I think is probably one of the top 5 books I've ever read, The Christian Imagination, Theology and the Origin of Race, has suggested that the problem is a diseased imagination, a diseased Christian imagination. There's something about that metaphor of a diseased imagination that also is very hopeful, because if it's diseased, then it means it's not intrinsic, but it actually there could be healing for the imagination. And so, that's what I'm interested in, is how do you heal the imagination?
Okay. Yeah. And not to go on an anti-capitalism rant or anything, because I'm not going to do that. But the way that advertising in our culture is so ubiquitous, what we're constantly being asked is imagine your life with this thing, this product. Exactly. Imagine if you bought this. Imagine what kind of person you would be if you drank this beer, or whatever or you had this clothing. And so, and you referenced like that feeling of like, oh, I feel like everything's engineered to make me hate my neighbor right now. And it's true, because these algorithms are using artificial intelligence to show you content that will evoke an emotional reaction, because that's what keeps you in the environment online. And that's what makes the advertising more valuable. Yeah. And then maybe we can relate this to just your imagination is negotiating the possibilities it's coming up with, and then doing this sort of like we talked about in theopsych, like system 1, system 2, like you're engaging this narrative, you're engaging this possibility with your imagination, and then you're negotiating between what you think is plausible based on your experiences. And then, but if you're getting hammered with one narrative, like this type of people is this way, this group of people is this way. And then you have sort of that narrative, and then other narratives that come alongside that would be like, oh yeah, that's plausible because I've heard these narratives, I've been thinking about that a lot lately. And
what is a conspiracy theory, but this like profound, powerful misfiring of collective imagination? Yeah.
Right. Mm-hmm.
And so we're already using our imaginations, and we're being formed. But the question is, what is really shaping us? And is it, if you're a Christian, you want the primary thing to be shaping your imagination is the story that comes to us in the incarnation, in life and death and resurrection of Jesus.
That part where you talk about that unique contribution of Christian faith being the symbol of the cross, or that central to the gospel is the event on the cross of God dying and resurrecting. And that just gave me a lot to think about. I kind of want to go back to how you came to your definition of imagination, which you got into a little while ago, but I have to get us to engaging some of the science too. So,
sure.
So when you were like, I'm going to write about imagination, and this is a cycle, this is a faculty of cognition, like, how did you approach that? And
sure. And I'll just say there's so many different dimensions to the imagination. And whether you start in sort of psych lit or phenomenology or philosophy, there's just so many different ways in. And, there's one author that Leslie Stevenson, who said there's 12 irreducible conceptions of the imagination. So
okay, only 12. Good.
Only 12. Yeah. She narrowed it down to 12 for us, it's interesting because, it's important to define the imagination because it, in some ways, is involved in the most rudimentary forms of perception, right? And then at the same time, it is involved in the most strenuous forms of making, right? Of poetic kind of making. And so there's maybe kind of this, that's Coleridge's classic definition, is that there's like the primary imagination, which has to do with perception, kind of just making sense of the world. So right now, all of these stimuli are hitting my sensory apparatus, and somehow I'm experiencing them as desk, wall, microphone. It comes to me, and my imagination puts it all together into a picture of the world that makes sense. And then on the other side, you have this very engaged and active sense of poiesis, of making, the poetic imagination, which is, sometimes we tend to think of, well, I'm not imaginative. Who's imaginative is, this artist or this filmmaker, or, people who are just really good at making and helping other people see, for example. So I was trying to find kind of common threads, and also look for an understanding of the imagination that worked for everyday life, sort of an everyday imagination. And so what I sort of narrowed down to, at least for my approach, is really the idea of possibility. So the subjunctive kind of mood, not what is or what ought to be necessarily, but what might be. Right. And even if I've noticed that some of, even like when I listen to people preach, that engage me in a particular way, you hear them a lot of times use language of possibility, like, well, perhaps this is the case, or what if, what you were experiencing as a burden, God intends as a blessing, or maybe, if you've ever heard like somebody kind of who's a communicator sharing in that kind of subjunctive mode, what they're really doing is engaging your imagination. And they're not asking you necessarily to either say yes or no to the truth claim, but they're painting a picture of what life in the world would be like if this thing was true. And so that's what you're sort of thinking through possibility. And then that connects to plausibility, where you kind of now meet the empirical world. So I love watching, for example, like Zack Snyder's, new cut, but I don't really think that a human being can fly, right? So that I'm sort of exploring the possibilities of superheroes, and that engages my imagination and tells me this story that's very human. But then as I think about just my embodied everyday life, I don't actually believe that people can, people can fly. So, and so that's sort of how it mediates between actuality and possibility through sort of your embodied, rooted, imaginative engagement with the world. And because it's always a negotiation, that's where you can have there's lots of space for innovation and for people thinking about things in ways that have not really been done before. Yeah. And so that's where all that sort of creativity comes from.
Yeah.
Where poetic making and perception kind of meld together. I don't know if that makes sense, but that's sort of a little bit about how I got to where I was. I didn't significantly engage the psych literature. So I'm now just starting to do that and to sort of read the ways that imagination is talked about there. And I'm really intrigued by it, especially with how often, the imagination is used. Like, for example, like in the forgiveness study that we did, where they're like, well, imagine yourself forgiving this person, And like, isn't that what forgiveness is in some ways, until you might not even actually have a real conversation with somebody who's wounded you, who's hurt you, but there is kind of this imaginative space in which you can enter in and practice something like forgiveness. So that's really interesting to me.
And all those studies correlating they call it imaging, right? Where they prime where people are using their imagination. So really dwell on the offense, like think about it for a while and write about it for a while, and then see, does that make you more likely to forgive or less likely to forgive?
Yeah.
And another thing is, I think you maybe brought up at some point, I have a memory of you bringing up like Tanya Luhrmann.
Yeah.
Because there's this aspect in which, especially psychologists who study religion, have found that you kind of have to put yourself in an insider mentality to really do justice to the folks you're studying. Do you want to comment on some of that? Yeah,
for sure. And I mean, that's, first of all, that book, When God Talks Back, I love that book. It was so fascinating to me. Because I grew up in communities that were at least adjacent to, if not the exact communities that she's writing about. And so it's kind of like reading an outsider's insider perspective on, yourself, But even with apologetics, in my book, this is something I try to get at, is there's some things about faith that you can really only understand from the inside. But apologetics, or even just Christian witness, evangelism, is about reaching people who are on the outside. So how do you help somebody who's on the outside understand something that can only be understood from the inside? And so that's why I'm sort of looking to the imagination to help with that. But and I've been reading a lot from Tanya Luhrmann, just some of the different studies that she's done. And she isolates absorption, which is sort of the self-altering attention. There's the Telegan scale, which is the thing that sort of measures absorption, traditionally measured propensity to hypnosis, but now also has been really valuable for tracing lots of other things. And she connects it to a person's talent for religious experiences. And she really tried to get herself to have religious experiences through contemplative practices of prayer. And that was super interesting to me as well. And you could sort of think of imaginative prayer in a lot of different ways. In one way, all prayer is imaginative in the sense that you are making present or becoming aware of the presence of something that's not accessible to your senses. And yet you also have, similar to these kind of imaging exercises that you might do in psychological trials, you have the Ignatian method of composition of scene, where you're imagining yourself in a gospel passage and it's saying, okay, imagine yourself standing in the crowd. Like, what are the smells? And that's the other thing too. It's not just visual. A lot of times we think the imagination is just sort of this mental picturing. But when you do composition of scene, you're being encouraged to use all of your senses. What does it feel like? What does it smell like? Is there the taste of salt in the air? If you're by the Sea of Galilee or something like that, which is very interesting because the imagination craves to kind of be rooted in our sensory experience. If you can't imagine yourself sensing something, you really can't imagine it. Yeah. So there's that interesting, like very kind of developed use of the imagination that the Ignatian method uses. And then there's also the other side of it, which would be more apophatic prayer exercises where you're trying to almost clear your mind, not just of images, but also of words, and just be completely receptive and resistant. And that also is maybe even a more difficult imaginative exercise, which is resisting any image from kind of being the primary one in hopes of actually experiencing a presence that transcends it. So I'm really interested in these various exercises of the imagination and the way that shapes our openness to the presence of God. And also whether, Luhrmann does this as sort of an outsider, whether commitment changes the experience. So whether you're sort of, okay, I'm willing to entertain this for the sake of the experiment versus I'm committed to this. I want this to be true. I want to encounter God, and how that changes the experience. And then also just does doing this as a Christian, is that different than doing it as a Buddhist or as a Sufi? Because Luhrmann did Christian prayer practices and experienced Christian meaning. She describes her experiences in terms of Christian meaning. So how does sort of your frameworks that you bring to the experience shape the experience? So lots of interesting things about that,
For sure.
And also I'm interested in the practice of mindfulness, which is sort of caught on as an imminent sort of contemplative prayer, and whether that is, I guess, for lack of a better word, thick enough, because there isn't necessarily like this metaphysical weight to it, like there is a Christian story. And yet you have all these similar practices of training your imagination, training your attention. So I mean, that's a lot of things, but those are the sorts of things that I'm interested in right now, and that I'm working on understanding with the imagination right now.
I resonate with your kind of call for everyone to just sort of realize that you're always imagining, you're always using your imagination, and your imagination is going to be up for grabs by the world and different environments that you find yourself in, and dialoguing with your imagination and shaping you in different ways. So this sort of mindful grasp of that fact, and then that assertion that God works through the imagination, that God wants to communicate through imaginative practices and exercises. Like, I think I have those similar instincts, and the mindfulness practice I have found to be very helpful in that, and like training the attention, because otherwise it feels like your imagination will just go wherever, like you're almost out of, you lose your agency in it almost, where you find yourself wandering for hours, and whatever grabs your attention, or possibly worries a big one, right? Like some people are more prone to worry about the future. Some people are more prone to replay the past, and mindfulness is very much a call to, be present, so.
Yeah. And that's the interesting thing too. One of the things about Luhrmann's work is it does tend, because it's very interested in absorption, it tends to emphasize intensity of imaginative experience, which it strikes me that there's lots of people who pray who don't really have that proclivity to absorption. You pray as almost this, it's more of the integrative and coherent, like the function of the imagination that's trying to make sense of experience. Rather than necessarily that is kind of having this very rich sensory experience of God. So there's definitely a sense that part of what I'm interested in is, I mean, if you're a Christian, I mean, who doesn't want to have more vibrant experiences of God, right? And yet so many people don't have those experiences
Yeah.
and yet don't give up faith. They continue to pray and they continue to move forward, even in the midst of not having sort of the imaginative payoff. And so I'm interested in that as well. What is that sort of more structural, praying the hours or something like that doing to your imaginative experience of the world versus, a prayer that is really seeking that affirmation in the imaginative encounter with God.
Mm-hmm. And I really like that anecdote you shared in the conclusion of your book. You talked about your wife being questioned about your choice to raise your children Christian. And then that seemed to be restricting their agency in some way. They should just be able to choose whatever religion they want when they grow up. And the response was something like that faith is actually brings freedom and is a gift that you're giving your children as your perspective. Am I getting that right?
Yeah, you're getting it right. Yeah, it was my wife's friend at work who, they were at a place where she could ask that, which would be a very invasive question if you didn't know somebody already. But it was very much like, why are you raising your children with faith rather than allowing them to choose what they want to believe for themselves? Mm-hmm. And of course, the frame there is that faith must be constrictive and rather than liberating. It would only be experienced as sort of a prison cell rather than actually something that opens up all of these possibilities, which is what I want to say, which I was trying to say with the cross. The cross is both the thing that we have to humble our imaginations before, because this too is a work of human imagination. It's the worst thing that humans could dream up. And yet the cross also lets us know that there are possibilities because of God's work that take the worst thing that humans can do and turn it for our good. And so this is to give my children this hope, right? Especially in a world that is full of fear, as far as, the next 20, 30 years and things like that. There's lots of reasons for fear. There's lots of reasons to worry, that legitimate reasons, to worry, whether it's more pandemics or, climate related things or, all of the different things that could go wrong. Mm-hmm. What better gift could I give them than a hope that is not rooted in the limitations of human imagination? And really the thing that has allowed Christians, not just in America, but Christians all over the world, to be in all sorts of difficult situations and yet have a hope that is bigger than the parameters of that situation.
Yeah, I've been thinking kind of lately, I think it was some of like Bill Newsom's talks from the third seminar where he's talking about free will and stuff. And just sort of in the real world, the connection between love and freedom, where in a very real way, if you're well loved, you flourish and you have more of a sense of agency and possibilities. If you're just on a human level, like if you're well loved by your caretakers or whatever, or by a church community or something, you flourish and you have more freedom and more options in life. And you can imagine more possibilities because you're not in a scarcity mindset or a survival mindset or something like that. But how much more so, like if God's love is real to you, then how much more could that also, just in a very like, in a practical sense, in a very like real lived sense, like it offers such freedom, I think. Just to piggyback to what you said. Love that. Well, anything else you want to add? What else are you working on right now? You said something else is in the lead right now. What are you working on? Yeah,
right now I'm working on a manuscript called Your Interpretation is Your Life, which is a book with Baker Academic. Mm-hmm. That's the tentative title right now. We'll see if it remains. I really like it right now, but you know how titles work. But It basically is saying, your interpretation of culture or of scripture or of whatever is happening is not really what you think about it. It's what you actually do, how you live, the life that you craft in response to all of these things. And so this book I'm trying to write a short book that you could give to seniors and college seniors who are graduating and kind of going out to do a job to help them navigate theology and culture. Mm-hmm. And so it looks at culture through 6 different lenses. So through meaning, the lens of meaning, the lens of power, the lens of ethics, the lens of religious experience, the lens of ritual and the lens of aesthetics, and then tries to kind of give a non-reductive approach to thinking about culture and the way that culture shapes us and the way we shape culture in response to it. So I'm trying to write a short book that is accessible, but also, scholarly. So it's one of those things where it's about 40% done. And we'll see how it goes. Yeah.
Sounds great.
But that's my current project. Yeah.
Cool. I wondered if you had an answer to this question. It's okay if you don't. But if you could see more psych studies, if you could just be in charge of some psych studies, what would you, what would they be? Like, what empirical questions would interest you?
Yeah. Like I said, I feel like I don't even know enough to be dangerous yet. I mean, I'm still kind of so new to this. And to the way the questions are asked, and it's so interesting just how careful, theologians, we just make these massive rhetorical statements, and just the care and the narrow scope, of the claims that are made. Yeah, I'm learning so much from that, and realizing like Justin Barrett says, like, there's a lot of times where theologians make these empirical claims, or these rhetorical things that can be empirically shown, and I think that's chastened me in the way that I've done theology and has helped me to think of what sort of things would be helpful. I would be really interested, just because of the work I'm doing right now, on studies of prayer practices, similar to what Luhrmann has done, but not necessarily looking to study absorption as much as some of these other ways that prayer functions in the life of a believer. So not a prayer that is seeking to hear God's voice, which is, what she's really interested in, is these experiences we have of God becoming real, so that it's almost like God is in the room with you. And it strikes me that is part of what Christian prayer is, but there's all these other elements to Christian prayer. And so I'd be interested in studying prayer practices of various sorts, like I enumerated earlier, and seeing how each of these prayer practices sort of shapes people's understanding of their faith and what commitment does to it. Yeah. All of those sorts of things. And there have been studies that show that participation in these kind of imaginative training exercises increases empathy. So empathy is connected to it. Openness to experience is connected to it. But I'm interested in, some other things, like, do people actually experience God, or do they understand themselves as experiencing God, especially if they didn't think they were going to, as a person of faith who wants to understand religious experience, and who obviously, who also wants to have religious experiences, wants to have a real sense of God myself, and wants my children to have that and my students to have that. I'm very interested in structural conditions and things like that. And so those are the sorts of things that I'm interested in from a psych side.
Have you read or engaged with any of Sarah Lane Ritchie's work?
I read part of her dissertation, and the stuff on psychedelics is so interesting. Spiritual, she calls it spiritual technologies.
That's correct.
And and I find it so kind of fascinating. I think at one point she makes the claim, or she says that maybe if you can get here through psychedelics, you can get here through contemplative prayer practices. And I think that's so interesting. You know what I mean?
And something that's reported a lot with psychedelic experiences, and then also with very experienced practitioners of meditation, is no longer fearing death. I think that is so interesting. And you mentioned that came up in your book, and that immediately
Sarah
made
Coakley.
Me think of, Sarah Coakley says that, right? And then that immediately made me think of this research about psychedelics and meditation practices. So, I mean, it's interesting when you get into some of that stuff, because obviously these practices we do with our body, whether we sing, we pray, it's all engaging the body. So hence the term technologies. Even dimming the lights in the worship service could be considered a spiritual technology, whatever gets your focus and attention into the spirit of worship. So, All right. Well, I don't want to take up too much of your time, Justin, but really appreciate you taking the time to talk about this stuff.
Yeah, for sure. It's been a really good conversation.